My name is Sandra Pierce. I am 31 years old. And on a Tuesday morning in October, I was standing in the departures terminal of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport saying goodbye to my husband when a woman came running through the crowd and grabbed his arm. She was screaming before she reached us. Not words at first, just sound, the kind that cuts through airport noise the way nothing else does, that makes heads turn and conversations stop and strangers look up from their phones. By the time she reached us and closed her hand around my husband's arm, every person within 30 feet had already stopped moving. She turned to me. Her eyes were wild and certain at the same time, the eyes of someone who has been building toward a moment for a long time and has finally arrived at it. "He is my husband," she screamed. "Not yours." The crowd that had gathered went completely still. Two security officers who had been stationed near the checkpoint began moving toward us. Slowly at first, and then with more purpose, as the scene clarified itself. All eyes were on me. I felt my legs go weak in the way they go weak when something is happening that your mind has not yet caught up to. My carry-on bag was still on my shoulder. I was still holding the coffee I had bought at the terminal cafe 10 minutes earlier. Everything about the previous 10 minutes had been completely ordinary, and now nothing was. She pulled out her phone. She thrust the screen toward my face with a hand that was shaking with something, fury or conviction, or both.
"See," she said.
"We are married. Look at it." On the screen was a photograph, a wedding photograph, and the man in it, standing at an altar in a dark suit, smiling at the camera, was my husband, James. The crowd started whispering. I looked at James. He had not moved, had not flinched, had not spoken. He was standing with a stillness that I recognized, the particular stillness of a man who is not surprised, who has been waiting with the patience of someone who prepared for this, for exactly this moment to arrive. He looked at me first. His eyes were steady and calm and held something in them that I understood without words. Wait. Trust me. Watch. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a single folded document. He handed it to the nearest security officer. Slowly, calmly, without a word, the security officer unfolded it and read it. The woman's face dropped. The certainty in her eyes collapsed all at once, like a structure whose foundation has just been removed. Her hands started shaking, not with fury this time, with something else entirely. What James did next destroyed her completely, and the entire airport went silent. But before I tell you what actually happened, please like and subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's begin. James Pierce and I have been married for 4 years. We met when we were both 26 at a conference in Charlotte, North Carolina. He was there representing the cybersecurity firm he worked for. I was attending as part of my role at a healthcare data company. We were seated at the same roundtable session and spent the entire 2 hours passing notes in the margins of the agenda, like people who had immediately found the one other person in the room worth talking to. We had dinner that evening. We talked until the restaurant closed. We exchanged numbers and spent the following 3 weeks in the specific delirious state of two people who have recognized something in each other that they were not expecting to find. He was from Savannah, Georgia, originally. Thoughtful and precise in the way of someone who has spent years working in security, accustomed to thinking carefully about vulnerabilities, about the gaps between what appears to be true and what actually is. He was also the warmest person I had ever met, which sounds like it should contradict the precision but doesn't. He was both things completely. We dated for 2 years. We got engaged on a Saturday morning in his Savannah apartment when he made breakfast and placed the ring beside my coffee cup without ceremony, which was exactly right for both of us. We got married the following June with 60 people in a botanical garden in Atlanta. 4 years of marriage that I had never had reason to doubt for a single day. Which is why the woman at the airport was so disorienting, not because I believed her, but because I didn't understand what she was. I should tell you about the weeks before the airport. James had been working on a case. I use the word loosely because his work at the cybersecurity firm occasionally overlapped with law enforcement matters in ways he could not always discuss in detail. What he had told me, about 3 weeks before the airport incident, was that something was developing at work that I should be aware of in general terms. that there was a woman connected to a fraud investigation the firm was supporting who had become what he called a complicating factor, that I might encounter something strange, and that if I did, I should stay calm and trust him. I had asked, reasonably, what that meant. He had said he couldn't give me more detail yet, but that he was handling it and that I would understand everything when the moment came. I had accepted this. For years of marriage to James Pierce had taught me that when he said he was handling something, he was handling it. He was not a person who left loose ends. I had filed his warning in the back of my mind and mostly forgotten about it until the moment a woman came running through the Atlanta airport and grabbed his arm. Her name, I learned afterward, was Cassandra Wells. She was 34 years old and she had, for the previous 18 months, been the subject of a joint investigation between James's cybersecurity firm and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Atlanta. The investigation concerned a sophisticated fraud operation that Cassandra had been running with two associates, a scheme that targeted financially comfortable married men, gathered detailed personal information about them, and used that information to construct false identities and false relationships. In several cases, she had gone further, fabricating legal documents, including what appeared to be marriage certificates, and using those fabrications to make financial claims against her targets or their families. James had come into contact with the case 8 months earlier when the firm was brought in to trace a series of fraudulent digital document submissions connected to one of her earlier targets. He had, within 3 months, identified Cassandra as the architect of the operation. He had been working with the FBI since then to build a case sufficient for prosecution. Cassandra, for her part, had identified James as the investigator who was unraveling her operation. And she had decided, in the particular logic of a person who has spent years successfully manipulating situations through performance and confrontation, that a public scene, a wife, an airport, witnesses, chaos, was her best remaining option for disruption. If she could create enough confusion, enough public doubt, enough of a mess for James to manage, she might slow the investigation. Buy herself time. She had not accounted for the document in his inside pocket. I need to go back to that moment. The crowd, the whispers, the phone shoved in my face. The photograph on her screen was real, in the sense that it had not been digitally altered. It existed as a physical print and as a file. It showed James standing at an altar in a dark suit. But the woman beside him in the photograph, whose face was partially turned away from the camera, was not Cassandra. The photograph was from our actual wedding. Cropped. Reframed. Presented without context in a way designed to suggest what it did not actually show. This was the kind of thing Cassandra was good at. Context removal. The strategic presentation of real elements arranged to produce a false conclusion. She had done it in financial documents, in legal filings, in communications with her targets. She was skilled and practiced, and she had calculated, standing in that airport, that a crying woman with a wedding photograph and a crowd of witnesses would be enough. She had not calculated James. He reached into his jacket and produced the document he had been carrying. He told me later he had begun carrying it 3 weeks ago, after warning me, because he had anticipated that she would attempt something public. The document was a single page, a sworn affidavit, notarized and dated, from the lead FBI agent on the investigation. It identified Cassandra Wells by name. It stated that she was the subject of an active federal fraud investigation. It stated that she had been known to produce fabricated documents, including false marriage certificates, as part of her scheme. And it stated that James Pierce was a cooperating witness and investigative consultant, that he was legally married to Sandra Pierce of Atlanta, Georgia, and that any claims to the contrary were elements of an ongoing fraud. The security officer read it. He read it twice. Then he looked up at Cassandra. She had seen the FBI letterhead from where she was standing. She had seen the case number. She had seen her own name. That was the moment her face dropped. James then did something I had not expected, even knowing what I knew. He calmly took out his phone and made a call. 1 call, 2 words when it connected. She's here. Within 4 minutes, 2 plainclothes agents who had apparently been stationed in the terminal. James told me later they had known Cassandra was likely to try something at the airport because her flight records had shown her tracking his travel schedule, appeared through the crowd, and identified themselves to the security officers. Cassandra looked at the agents. She looked at the document. She looked at James, who was standing with his hands in his pockets and his expression entirely composed. And then she did the thing that destroyed whatever remained of her performance completely. She sat down on the floor of the departures terminal and said nothing. Not a collapse, not dramatic or tearful. She simply sat down right there in the middle of the airport and became very still, as if all the energy that had been running the performance had simply switched off, as if there was nothing left to sustain it. The crowd, which had been whispering and jostling and filming on phones, went completely quiet. The agent spoke to her quietly. She was escorted away without incident. The security officers spoke briefly to James and then to me, took our information and released us. The crowd dispersed in the way crowds disperse when the event they gathered for has resolved itself without the drama they were anticipating. James turned to me. "I'm sorry," he said. "I wanted to tell you more, but I couldn't compromise the case." I looked at him. I thought about what it meant that he had been carrying that document for 3 weeks, that he had warned me in the only way available to him, that he had stood still in the middle of a crowd screaming at him because he had prepared for this and knew exactly what came next. "You could have told me more," I said. "Yes," he said. "I could have. That was wrong, and I should have managed it differently." I appreciated that he didn't argue the point. He was right that he should have told me more, and he knew he was right, and he said so. "Are you okay?" he asked. I considered the question honestly. My legs had stopped shaking. The coffee I had been holding was cold, and I didn't remember finishing it. The airport had resumed its ordinary noise around us, indifferent to what had just happened. "I will be," I said. "Go catch your flight." He smiled. He pulled me into a hug that lasted slightly longer than our usual airport goodbyes. Then he picked up his carry-on and went through the checkpoint. I stood in the terminal for a moment after he disappeared into the crowd. Then I picked up my bag and walked toward the exit. Cassandra Wells was charged 4 weeks later with federal fraud, identity theft, and fabrication of legal documents. The charges covered her activities across 3 states over a period of nearly 3 years. 2 associates were charged alongside her. The case went to trial 7 months later and resulted in convictions on all primary counts. I followed it, but not obsessively. It was not ultimately about me. I had been a bystander to the end of something James had been quietly and carefully building toward for 8 months. The resolution belonged to him and to the agents who had worked the case. What belonged to me was something smaller and more durable than a courtroom verdict. I think about that moment sometimes, standing in a crowd of strangers while a woman screamed that my husband wasn't mine. The weakness in my legs, the coffee going cold in my hand, the instinct to speak, to defend myself, to demand explanation. And James, still and calm and completely unafraid, reaching into his jacket for the thing he had been carrying for 3 weeks. He had prepared for the worst moment he could imagine, and he had carried the answer to it quietly, without drama, waiting for the moment it was needed. That is who I married. That is who I have been married to for 4 years. Some people you trust because you have no reason not to. And some people you trust because you have watched them, over time, in ordinary moments and impossible ones, be exactly who they said they were. James Pierce has never been anything other than exactly who he said he was. And in the middle of a crowded airport on a Tuesday in October, that turned out to be more than enough.